I'm going to start with you, Bob, because a lot of people may not know, who you are or what you do. Could you tell us a bit about your background?
Sure. I spent 43 years working for one company, which is very unusual these days. I started with Douglas Aircraft Company as a summer job. And as my career was evolving in 1968, I was asked by my boss if I had any ideas about what he could tell the Air Force about how we'd get to orbit 10 years from now. And so for a joke, I said, well, why don't you tell them how the alleged UFOs do it? He said, that's a great idea. Why don't you work on that? So that was when I read my first UFO book. It was by Don Menzel. And I looked at it and I concluded that this guy is ignoring all the data. And then I read another 50 books. And a year later, I was standing in for my boss to report on how well we were doing on contracts. So it's our job was to get new contracts. And I said, well, we're doing fine. I gave him the regular report, and then afterwards they said, well, Dr. Wood, we don't hear from you very often. Could you tell us a little bit about what you do that's interesting? And so in a moment, I decided to say, well, you're not going to believe this, but in fact, I've read 50 UFO books, and the only thing that's unclear to me, since it's clear to me that they are manned by extraterrestrials, the only thing that's unclear is to whether or not we figure out how they work before or after Lockheed. Lockheed was our competitor at the time. And there was a long moment of silence, and my immediate boss, who was the vice president, my boss's boss, said, what would he think it would take to look into that? And so the net result of that conversation is over the next year and a half, we spent $500,000 of company money trying to look into how UFOs worked. We hired a detective to interview alleged witnesses. We hired a physicists to create new theories. We set up a little laboratory to spin magnets, and we bought a van to go to the top of mountains and record whatever we could see. And after a year and a half, we knew one thing, and that was how fast we were spending the money. We had no idea how close we were getting to the answer, so we canceled the project. And at that time, I got reassigned to come to live in Newport Beach, actually, and work on the ballistic missile defense program. So for the next 8 years, I became a BMD radar guy. And then for the years after that, I worked on improving our independent research and development scores, which was very helpful dollar-wise. And I wound up working on the International Space Station at the end of my career. So I had a fun career working on missiles and winding up in space. Was involved at the high level of management for most of the time I was a director. I never was willing to put in the 70 hours a week required to make it to VP. But when I retired in 1993, I was very happy. And then one of the guys that I had hired for this project was Stan Friedman, because he had a reputation of knowing about the literature.
Was this the UFO project that put you on? They
UFO
paid you to hunt UFOs.
Yeah, right. So when I retired in 1993, about a year later, I got a call from my former employee, Stan Friedman, and said, I've got a document that's a fax of something that looks kind of interesting. It says, technology, recovery and disposal. He says, a fax. Would you be interested in trying to authenticate it? And I said, sure. So I did that, and that's when I became involved in authenticating questioned leaked UFO documents that were classified. And this particular document turned out to be a winner because I went personally to the government printing office and showed it to a guy who was involved at that time. 1954 was the time of the document. And he looked at it and he said, well, based on the content, I'd say this is a hoax, because the title was Extraterrestrial Entities and Technology, Recovery and Disposal. They were telling about how we get started in this program, how you keep the public in the dark, how you lie to them to make sure they don't report UFOs. So anyway, it turned out to be authentic. The guy looked at it and he said, well, based on the content, I would say it's phony. But based on the fact that there's a raised Z and the type font is exactly the type font that was used in 1954, which I was responsible for, he said, I would say it clearly was printed by a government printing office in 1954, no question about it. So that established my credibility in the UFO community. And people started sending me more question documents to authenticate, many of which were top secret.
So you wound up in this position where you're now the guy
Yeah, I'm the
to
guy.
talk to about
Yeah,
authenticating these
yeah,
documents. And by
right.
the way, on that particular document, I remember finding that online and reading it, and I was like, what is this? What is this?
Yeah.
You know, and I had some interest in the UFOs, and I found it fascinating. And could it be true? Now here I am sitting with a man who authenticated this thing. Let me ask you, before you came across those documents, before you read your first book, you're in college, did you have any interest or knowing of UFOs? And
I think I read one book by Gerald Hurd called Is Another World Watching? And his theory was that they must be insects because the accelerations would be sustainable only by insects that had their structural shell on the outside. And that's, as I recall, the only book I ever read until I read this first one by.
But it's playing our realm of knowledge of three-dimensional aerodynamics and nothing about inertial. Cancel.
Yeah, my degree was in aeronautical engineering, and then I had a PhD in physics at Cornell. Yeah. So that's why I got the job of being a radar expert, because they didn't have anybody who was a radar expert, and they figured anybody with a PhD in physics ought to be able to learn it. So that was how I got involved in radar.
I mean, even when you're out chasing these things, I mean, you said a camera, you're on the mountaintops with this van or what have you. Did you ever catch sight of anything while you were out there? Did you see anything?
No, we sent this van, I didn't go personally, but we sent this van to the top of a mountain where allegedly there had been many UFOs reported. And he was there for a week, and he took photographs of anything interesting, but there was nothing to see.
So it didn't really nothing you could put your finger.
That was a good example of why we canceled the project. You know, we spent all this money to instrument this van and got nothing.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating.
So that then after I established kind of a mini reputation in the UFO field, I got a call from a guy by the name of Joe Firmage. He says, I'm a .com executive. He said, I understand you've got question documents about UFOs. And I said, yes. He said, well, I'd like to borrow them and authenticate them. And so I said, well, and then he said, what do you think they're worth? I said, I don't know, they might be worth millions. So after that, then I called up Hal Puthoff, who was my friend, and said, this guy claims that he knows you. He said, oh yeah, Joe Firmage, he's a good guy. And so I called Joe back and said, yeah, okay. He said, well, I got a yacht in Newport Beach, and you live there. How about coming down this Sunday and showing me the documents? So I said, okay. So I found his boat, showed him all the documents. And my first wife had been pretty skeptical about my wasting my time on UFOs after I retired. So I had a little skeptical attitude when I visited with Joe. But Joe looked at him, he said, these are exactly what I want. And he said, what I'd like to do is I'd like to offer you the opportunity, if I authenticate these, then I will print 2,000 copies of the documents, and you can have those and sell them. And so I said, well, Joe, is that all? Did you have any other cash involved? Oh, he said, I forgot. And he opened his briefcase and he took out a check already made out to me for $500,000.
Wow. So, you know, the UFOs are clearly a complete waste of time for you.
That's right.
And you shouldn't focus any more time on that.
That's right. So I came home from that meeting, and my wife said, well, how'd the meeting go with Joe? And I said, well, pretty good. She looked at the check and said, how do you know it's any good? So,
Of course. Well, that's what women do. You know, they look at men sideways. That's their role in life.
right. So anyway, it turned out it was written on the same bank I banked with, so I went to my bank the next morning, and they said, can you tell me about this account? And 2 minutes later, they said, the money's all in the account. So I called up Joe and said, Joe, we'd like to accept your deal. This was actually a joint with my son, who was involved a little bit.
Now, was it just the one document we talked about a moment ago with the crash recovery?
No. It was a whole pile of documents. It was that plus a number of others, probably 30 or so documents. So anyway, the check was good. We cashed it, and Joe did exactly what he promised to do. He had his company print 2,000 copies of these documents, and we were getting such interest that he said he wanted to make a video of the truth. He said, you know, I'll give you $300,000 to do that. Actually, it was $250,000. So my son and I went to Hollywood and found out there were 5 different ways to get screwed in Hollywood. We found them all.
I'm sure there's more than 5. Yeah, there's more than 5.
But anyway, we did create this video called The Truth, Evidence That We Are Not Alone. And everybody was happy with that. And then Joe went on to other things. And by then, my son and I were clearly involved in the process of studying the subject.
I want to, if you wouldn't mind, could you tell us a little bit about MJ12 and those documents and how you came into that whole scenario? Because I know the website out there that you and your son have just a ton of information out there.
Well, yeah, the website is majesticdocuments.com, and that's where my son actually set up that website. And in that website, we put in a high-quality scanned copy of every document that we have. Actually, most of whom, all of which are in the other room, just a few feet away from where we are. Each document has a story to tell of its own, and then there's an authentication issue associated with each one, varying from really rock solid occasionally, where it's a copy of something that was supposed to go to the MJ12 of the CIA, to documents that seem to be the right kind of words at the right time, written by the right guy, but you can't prove that they're actually were, in fact, top secret documents.
So I get the impression that maybe there's, I haven't really dug too deep in all honesty. I'm not super familiar with MJ12, a little inkling about that. So for our viewers who don't know.
Well, I think a good example of an MJ12 document would be one that was written during the very early part of the war, actually just before the war, because at the so-called Battle of L.A., which is like February 25th, 1942, after we shot down after we used 1,430 rounds of ammunition to try to shoot down one or more craft, then there was some information that Bill Tompkins got, but also there were some documents that were written, one by Marshall, who was the head of the Army, and to FDR, and one from FDR back that basically said, one of the documents said that we had recovered 2 craft. One was shot down in the San Bernardino Mountains, and the other was salvaged by the Navy at sea.
So thank you for that, because I know I've talked to Bill a bit, and we've discussed this in our conversations, but other than what Bill has said, I was unaware that there was actual documentation that indicates that actually happened.
That's the earliest top secret documents that I've seen, and then it begins a string of classified documents throughout. One of the things that Bill told me recently that surprised me a little bit is that the documents that he was dealing with, even though they were clearly super top secret, were not stamped at all. And the Navy seemed to feel that was better protection if you just control physically.
Bill, was it an issue of better protection, or was it just they hadn't maybe advanced their compartmentalization of security to that point?
Actually, like Bob says, it was so classified, the best thing to do is not classify it at all and keep it in your own facilities. And the admiral that was handling that, Admiral Riccobotta, 4-star, that was his approach. He just said, we're not going to put any document out of this facility that's even confidential. So every trip that we made, we didn't handle any security documents. Unbelievable.
So all these documents you're digging up that you're now authenticating, be they MJ12 or other governmental documents that are kind of pointing some kind of evidence, be it circumstantial or otherwise, they're not marked. They don't really kind of give the blessing that this thing ever existed within a security structure.
Well, the documents I'm talking about, MJ12 documents, were all marked.
Oh, those were marked.
Oh, yeah, those were marked top secret. And in some cases, only secret, but mostly the ones that were really important were the ones that were marked top secret. The people who challenge, the skeptics sometimes who challenge the authenticity.
Yeah, let's talk about them. I mean, what kinds of things are they saying?
Well, one thing they say is that the first place, they don't follow the procedures for classifying documents. And then they go into detailing, this is what the procedure says, and this document doesn't follow that procedure. And so they're unwilling to accept that the security person in charge of a program can do whatever he cares, no matter what the official rules say. And that idea has just never seeped through into their minds. So that's the first challenge, is they don't follow the procedures. And then, of course, the skeptics go on to say, well, how would you ever keep this secret? You know, and that's still an extremely valid question. I mean, as I've talked more and more to Bill and learned more about what really went on that we didn't learn about, I mean, basically, if you can convince somebody that the Germans got to the far side of the moon before the war ended, then you can convince them of anything. But it's very hard to make that first step. But that's where it is. I think we really need to establish the fact that there's a process in place that actually controls what the public can learn in multiple levels of great sophistication, and that's been going on since the Manhattan Project. It started with compartmentalization.
Yeah. So for you, it's a chase, really. I mean, I can see the passion you have with this. I mean, you've got to be doing it for this long. I mean, there's a passion there, clearly. For you, based on all the research you've done, is MJ-12 real?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. They don't know everything that's going on, though. The MJ-12 people who were mostly associated with Air Force thought that they were a separate entity and were really in charge of everything. But what they didn't know is that, in my judgment, the Navy took the ship that they got in 1942 and they started to reverse engineer it right away. They didn't wait for anybody but Forrestal to tell them to go ahead and do it. And so I don't know where they did it, but China Lake would have been a good place to start. So my guess is that craft got shipped to the Navy, and the Navy people did the best they could to try to figure out how they worked. I think it still took the Navy, you know, a decade or so to get enough smarts to figure it out. But I think the Navy was the first to get the essential ingredients of trying to replicate them. The interesting, ironic thing is when I was first offered the opportunity in 1968 to figure out how they work by my management, the thing that makes me really think twice now is that it had already been done when I'm in 1968. I'm sure that the Navy knew how they worked by then, and probably the Air Force too.
Interesting, but Douglas didn't.
No.
No. As close as Douglas was to the Navy, you'd think, you know, hey.
Well, the first crash actually was a crash at Cape Girardeau when there was a minister who was asked to come up to bless the bodies. And that crash, the Army got parts and the FBI got parts. And then, of course, in the Battle of LA, the Army got more parts and the Navy got parts. The CIA, in the meantime, was lurking in the corners trying to get their hands on whatever they could, the counterintelligence people, the CIA, Angleton in particular. So that these multiple agencies all trying to keep control of the recovered parts, not knowing that their colleagues had other parts.
Well, I mean, but Bill, your book kind of touches on a little bit of that tug of war with parts and pieces.
Yes.
So it's just interesting to hear you talk about this, and we get to read about it in Bill's book as well.
So yeah, the remarks that I'm making right now are different from the ones I would have made 10 years ago before I met Bill.
Yeah, well, see, let's talk about that. So let's go there. Let's talk about, here's a man, PhD, Cornell, aeronautics engineer degree from Colorado, basically a rocket scientist, right? Cooling systems, I believe, on the rockets is what you said. 43 years at McDonnell Douglas, a stellar career. And you've got this gentleman who was pulled out of the 9th grade, thrown into the service. And and now here he is pitching this program that fixes everything for Debus and von Braun, and it becomes, our Apollo program. How did you two get together? How does a guy like you connect with a guy like this and then cross over? Tell us a little bit about this story, about the thought process you had to go to kind of, quote unquote, come on board with the reality of the ETs.
Well, let Bob say how we got together, because it's really one of his friends in the business that got me to go with Bob.
Well, my recollection of first talking to Bill was on the phone when I got a phone call from him. And he started telling me a little bit about his story. And so I wrote down a page's worth of notes. And I thought, well, this is kind of unbelievable.
Thank you for being honest.
But I had one of the jobs I was given back at Douglas Aircraft was to interview people from the outside world who had ideas. And I found that no matter how wild or weird they sounded, it was always good to listen to them, because one time out of 10, their idea would be based on some facts. So I had trained myself to never turn anybody off just because they had a wild idea. So I listened to everything that Bill had to say, took notes, and concluded he had some interesting things. And I think we concluded that we had to meet face to face.
Right.
And so, so you had this practice, having worked at Douglas and have done this before, so you're just practicing the same thing over the phone with Bill. What was this, a few years ago? When did you all meet?
2009.
2009.
It took a long time. He said, well, I've been writing a book. And it turned out he had been writing a book with, I think, at least 3 other kinds of editors who were unable to extract words that could be printed. And so I looked at what had been written so far and concluded that it needed a lot of work. And in terms of sequencing things, in terms of sometimes the grammar and stuff like that. Sure. But his story fundamentally intrigued me, and I think it was probably only after the first year or so I felt, well, this guy's, he's real, he's telling the truth, he's telling everything as best as he can remember it. And I wish I could remember as much as he can remember, that many years ago. But I never doubted for a moment, well, after we became acquainted, that what he was telling me was as best as he could remember what really happened. He didn't evaluate or embellish on anything. If he didn't know the answer, he said he didn't know. And so that made me feel comfortable that.
Not quite, because for the first 6 months, he didn't believe one word I was telling him.
Chime in anytime, Bill. Let's hear it.
Yeah.
So anyway, we started shaping the book up, and it took a long time till I got seriously interested in actually making this a real book. And I forget exactly what it was that triggered me, but in the last 2 years, was it 2014, I guess it was,
Yeah.
we really started to look at drafts. And then, because I had published a book called Alien Viruses using Richard Dolan and CreateSpace, which is Amazon's subsidiary, I was encouraged to think about how easy that would be just to publish it myself. So rather than trying to find somebody to do the publishing, I just learned enough about how to do it online myself. And I concluded all you needed to have was some JPEGs and a Word document that was correct. Push the button and
Off it goes.
they'll tell you what's wrong.
Yeah. Tell me about how you first learned about Bill at Douglas Aircraft.
Well, after Bill told me the story, of course, the first thing that was obvious was that he worked at the same place I worked at. And he worked in the same building I worked at and knew the same people I knew. And so and he had copies of the memos on our same format. So I thought, well, the one thing that I can absolutely attest is that his story of being at Douglas Aircraft is valid. And all the people who were on the copies of the memos were men I knew. Now, because I was an engineer who dealt with thermodynamics and radar later, typically, and Bill knows better than anybody, the engineers typically look down on the draftsmen. The engineers, basically create the design, and the draftsmen merely just put their pencils on the paper and do this trivial stuff. So that's the way engineers thought about draftsmen. So even had I wanted to find out more about what Bill was doing, he was working in ground support electronics, which I had nothing to do with.